The decree forbidding members of the nobility to hold military commands obliged my father to resign from the Army of the Rhine, where he had succeeded Monsieur de Custine as commander-in-chief. He withdrew to his estate at La Ferté-Beauharnais, where after a short time he was placed under arrest and brought back to the prison of the Carmelites in Paris. My mother, although she went to see all the persons who had helped her in the case of Mademoiselle de Béthusy, she was unable to even learn the reasons for his imprisonment. In fact, her steps in his behalf resulted in her own arrest, and the only favor she was able to secure was that of being confined in the same prison as her husband. What intense grief we felt the morning we were told that she had entered our room to bid us farewell. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She had not wished our slumber to be disturbed. "Let them sleep," she said to our governess. I could not bear the sight of their sorrow. I would not have the strength to part from them. Ah, how tragic an awakening we had. We were alone, separated from both our parents. This was my first encounter with unhappiness. My brother Eugène, in spite of his youth, possessed already that energy which is part of a courageous nature. His longing to see our parents was so intense that he was convinced he could make his wish come true. He hurried off to see Tallien and informed him of our misfortune. I waited impatiently to learn the outcome of the interview. It seemed impossible to me that anyone could resist my brother's eloquence. But alas, he who had helped us before was no longer in a position to do so. Under the menace of terror, men's hearts had frozen and become inaccessible to the appeal of justice and pity. Innocence, deprived of all her defenders, was left to perish. How true it is that our earliest impressions mark our nature with an indelible stamp and frequently produce beneficial results. The thought of the joy I should have felt on this occasion had my petition been favorably received was what aroused in me a longing to comfort, protect, and befriend all those in affliction. In other words, that impulse to do good, which is the only thing that makes power and position worth having. Our principal interest now became the daily package we sent the prisoners, in which we included whatever articles they might be in need of. Entrance to their prison was forbidden us. After a short time, we were not allowed to correspond with them. To replace our letters, we added to the list of articles included in the package the phrase, "Your children are in good health." The gatekeeper, however, was harsh enough to rub out this remark. In order to circumvent him, we took turns in copying the list so that the sight of our two handwritings might assure our parents we were both still alive. About this time, a law passed that all children of noble birth must learn a trade. My brother, in spite of our governess's despair, chose that of a carpenter. Mademoiselle de Lannoy was constantly criticizing the Republican form of government. She laid claim to a title at a time when everyone else was concealing his and declared about everything that took place. A thing like that would never have been allowed to happen under the old regime. Nevertheless, for the sake of our parents, she allowed Eugène to go to the carpenter who was near by and take lessons. His teacher was an ardent Jacobin who, with pride displayed as trophy, a hammer belonging to Louis XVI, which had been acquired at the sack of the Palace of the Tuileries. With him lived two sisters, former nuns, who were as subdued in their manner as he was violent. In spite of his political views, the carpenter was always polite to my brother, and the two sisters used to give Eugène secretly little images of the Virgin and the saints, which he brought delightedly home to me as rewards he had received for his good work. Although we were no longer living with the Princess de Hohenzollern, we went to see her every Sunday. Her brother had been arrested at the same time as our father. In her loneliness and worry, she welcomed our presence as a relief. To us in our isolation, she was a moral support. It was during this period that orders were given for a patriotic banquet to be held simultaneously all over Paris. On this solemn occasion, tables were to be spread in the street, and masters and servants, men, women, and children were to eat side by side regardless of rank. To evade the law was to risk being arrested. In order to make it impossible to disobey this decree, everyone had been obliged to inscribe his name on a placard affixed to the main entrance of the house where he lived. It happened that the mansion in which we were staying was nearly deserted. My mother was in prison, and the same fate had befallen an American West Indian family who were friends of hers and who also lived there. Our manservant, our chambermaid, the porter and his wife, my brother, and I played the landlords on this occasion. My governess, who claimed to belong to the old family of de Lannoy of Flanders, was furious at the idea of being obliged to sit beside the servants and the porter. She, who had been brought up at the convent of Saint-Cloud, who on 2 occasions had caught a glimpse of the Queen, could not admit such a state of social chaos. Once more she assured us, a thing like that would never have been allowed under the old regime. Like any other children of our age, we were delighted to see our governess humiliated. Moreover, in spite of our youth, both my brother and myself were aware that her ridiculous pretensions might do harm to the cause of our parents. The table was laid outside the entrance of the house, and we were about to sit down to our meal when we were startled by the cries of some passersby who addressed us by the terrifying epithet of aristocrats. It seems we were at fault in not placing the table in the middle of the roadway. We hastened to correct this error. The weather was fine. The lights set on the tables, the crowd in the streets, some eating, some strolling about out of curiosity, formed a curious scene. In order to have made it still more brilliant, the windows of the houses should have been illuminated. Because in the purely residential districts where there were no shops, the streets were too dark. After supper, we asked Mademoiselle de Lannoy to take us through some of the other parts of the city that were more crowded and consequently livelier than the neighborhood where we lived, close to the junction of the Boulevard Saint-Germain and the Rue Saint-Dominique. In the business section, the tables were lined up one after the other. Some of them were decorated with a roof of green boughs. The whole effect was attractive. Nevertheless, general gaiety was lacking. Every face wore an expression of uneasiness. Vagabonds in rags wandered about the city, drinking and shouting revolutionary songs. They carried terror into the hearts of the peaceable middle class, who were still further alarmed by their bellicose manner. Only in the poorer quarters was any trace of natural high spirits or spontaneous merrymaking to be found. As we passed, a shoemaker clad in his working clothes rose from his table, came up beside our governess, and embraced her. You may be sure she lost no time in taking us back to the house, announcing as she did so, a thing like that would never have been allowed under the old regime. My brother, as he witnessed the discomfiture of Mademoiselle de Lannoy, glanced at me maliciously because the good woman was extremely plain. Eugene claimed the shoemaker's action was prompted simply by a desire to correct Mademoiselle's haughtiness of bearing. I said, I'm very glad to be only a little girl, for that horrid man might have tried to kiss me too. I would not have allowed him to, answered Eugene, drawing himself up with the full dignity of his 12 years. I can still remember some of the other festivities of this period. They were planned on a grand scale and were frequently imposing, but in later years I have found the working classes enjoying their pleasures more genuinely than they did during the period of which I am now writing. Although the power wielded by the crowd was very great, it was accompanied by a sense of responsibility and a feeling of uneasiness. Poverty was widespread. The intoxication of the days of the Federation had been replaced by a feeling of alarm and of terror, which ran through all the strata of society. Even those who used fear as a weapon were its victims, and frequently were cruel only because they themselves were afraid. One day, I was returning to the Rue Saint-Dominique after paying a visit to the Princess of Hohenzollern. Her youngest chambermaid was with me, my brother having stayed home to study. As we turned a corner, we caught sight of a crowd of men advancing towards us to the sounds of loud music. People in the streets sought refuge wherever they could. As the crowd approached, doors and windows closed precipitately. Not even the porters put their heads out of the gate to see what was happening. The maid and I were frightened to find ourselves thus absolutely alone in the street. We dared neither advance nor retreat, but huddled under the overhanging porch of a monumental gateway. I never found out where the mob was going. I can only remember seeing a throng of men with bare arms singing the revolutionary Ça ira and the Marseillaise go past me carrying a Statue of Liberty. I was still very young, but their wild behavior, even though I did not know its significance, frightened me extremely. I grew more terrified when I saw the mob stop in front of a house directly across the street from where we were, to the accompaniment of savage Curses! The crowd attempted to break in the doorway and scale the walls. As they did so, they accused the owners of the house of being aristocrats and threatened to hang them from the lamppost. The cause of this outburst was that, in passing, they had caused sight of a carving of the Virgin on the front of the house. Ladders were quickly obtained from somewhere or other, and the crowd, with swords, hacked and mutilated the carving. Such behavior profoundly disturbed my religious beliefs. My terror was replaced by a feeling of commiseration for the unfortunate beings who, by committing such an act, had incurred the dire penalties that Providence would certainly inflict. My pious imagination pictured these chastisements in detail, and I pitied those upon whom they were about to fall. Finally, the mob continued on its way, but instead of going to meet my brother, I returned to the house of the Princess de Hohenzollern and told her what I had just seen. The princess scolded me for having gone out with the youngest chambermaid, for it was always the eldest one who was supposed to take me home. There was a Revolutionary Guard stationed at the princess's house. She had under her care her nephew, the Prince of Salm, and a young English girl whom she was bringing up. The four of us were too young to understand the events that were going on about us, and we used to laugh and play on the terrace of the Salm Palace. At present, the Chancellerie of the Légion d'Honneur, Quai d'Orsay, with all the unconcern of youth. Yet, daily at a certain hour, when we caught sight in the distance of crowds gathering on the Place Louis XV, around a structure we knew to be a scaffold, we would hang our heads, look away, and re-enter the house heavy at heart, nor could we restrain the flood of tears when we thought of the unfortunates whose last hour had come. Little did we imagine, however, that our parents might someday suffer the same fate. Convinced of their innocence, we waited impatiently the moment of their release. It was during this period that the Princess de Hohenzollern suffered a loss which further increased her fears for the safety of those who were especially dear to us. She had offered the hospitality of the Salm mansion to a young Polish woman, the Princess Lubomirska, 24 years of age and very beautiful. Acting with the thoughtlessness that characterizes youth, the latter had presumably made remarks criticizing the government then in power. She was arrested and immediately executed. One of the ceremonies which took place during the Revolution, and which I remember particularly well, was the Feast of the Supreme Being, which was held on Sunday, June 8th, 1794. Acting at the suggestion of Robespierre, the convention had officially recognized the existence of a supreme being and the immortality of the soul. A day was set apart for the celebration of this event. The announcement was received with satisfaction by all the people we knew. Our writing teacher was an ardent Jacobin, our professor of history and foreign languages, a no less fervent royalist, but both at this time regarded Robespierre with an equal degree of admiration in spite of the difference of their political views. Robespierre was then the president of the convention. It was rumored that, taking advantage of the celebration, he was to proclaim himself king, free all prisoners, and reestablish peace, order, and religion. I can remember that everyone looked forward to the festive day as bringing with it the end of all our troubles. In spite of the existing financial crisis, we did not suffer from a lack of funds. Every month, Monsieur Henri, a banker in Dunkirk, sent us certain fixed allowance, which he afterwards drew through London on my grandmother, who still retained possession of her plantation in Martinique. This arrangement allowed our governess, even during our parents' absence, to provide us with all the comforts to which we'd been accustomed. The day of the celebration at last arrived. To attend the ceremony, I dressed in a white linen frock with a large blue belt. My curly hair fell loosely over my shoulders. As she dressed me, the maid said, "You must look very, very pretty today, for perhaps we shall get word your father and mother are to be let out of a prison, and you will be allowed to see them and give them a kiss." The idea of this possibility made me almost mad with delight. On arriving at the Tuileries, we saw the members of the convention file down a long wooden staircase that had been erected near the central hall and led to the garden. All were in full dress. In front of the rest came a single figure, conspicuous from the fact that he alone had his hair powdered. "That is Robespierre," cried the crowd. "He is the only deputy who powders his hair. Listen to what he will say." We could not hear a word. The deputies approached the great central basin in the garden, which had been drained dry. In it had been placed various wooden statues representing atheism and other false doctrines. These had been surrounded with inflammable material. A lighted torch was handed to Robespierre. With it, he set fire to the structure. In an instant, everything had been destroyed, and a mass of smoke and flame rose skyward. A lighted spark fell on my dress, burning my chest. My linen frock caught fire, and it was only with difficulty that the flames were extinguished, and I was carried back to where we lived. To add to my suffering, nothing was said about freeing the prisoners. Thus it was in pain and anguish that I ended a day I had looked forward to with joyous anticipation. One day a woman we did not know called at our house and wished to have us accompany her, but without giving any further details. Mademoiselle de Lannoy objected. Thereupon, the woman produced a note in my mother's handwriting, giving us permission to go with the stranger. After further hesitation, as she feared a trap, our governess yielded reluctantly. The woman led us to a garden situated in the Rue de Sèvres. Telling us not to make a sound, she led us into the gardener's cottage. Opposite, there was a big building. A window opened, and my father and mother appeared. Filling me with surprise and delight, I uttered a cry and stretched out my arms towards my parents. They made me a sign not to speak, but a sentinel on duty at the foot of the wall had heard us and gave the alarm. The unknown woman hurried us away. We learned later that the window of the prison had been piteously walled up. It was the last time I ever saw my father. A few days later, he was no more. A few moments before his execution, my father wrote my mother the following letter, a last testimony of his affection for us and his devotion to his country. 4th Thermidor, in the 2nd year of the Republic, one and indivisible. All the evidence given at the so-called examinations, which I have been today, inflicted on a number of prisoners, shows that I am the victim of foul calumnies spread by certain aristocrats who pretend to be patriots and are now confined here. The knowledge that this infernal conspiracy will not cease until it has brought me before the revolutionary tribunal deprives me of any hope of ever seeing you again, my friend, or of ever again embracing my children. I will not dwell on my regrets. My warm affection for my children, the brotherly fondness I have for you, must convince you of my feelings in this respect. I grieve also to leave a land I love, for which I would willingly have laid down my life 1,000 times over. Not only can I no longer serve France, but the manner of my death makes me appear an unworthy citizen. This torturing thought forbids me to beg you to cherish my memory. Try, however, to rehabilitate it. Prove that in the eyes of all men, a lifetime spent in serving our country's cause and in assuring the triumph of liberty and justice should outweigh the slanderous accusations of a few individuals, most of whom belong to classes we rightly look upon with suspicion. Yet this task of yours must not be undertaken immediately. For in the midst of revolutionary struggles, a great nation seeking to pulverize its chains must be ever watchful and more afraid to spare a guilty man than to punish unjustly an innocent one. I die not only with that calmness of mind, which in spite of everything allows us to think fondly of our dear ones, but also with that courage which animates a man who recognizes no master, whose conscience is clear, whose spirit is upright, whose most ardent wish is the prosperity of the Republic. Goodbye, dear friend. Console yourself for the sake of our children. Console them by enlightening their minds, and above all by teaching them that by their courage and patriotism they may efface from my name the blot of my execution and remind the world of my deeds and my claims to our nation's gratitude. Goodbye. You know those who are dear to me. Be a consolation to them, and by your care prolong my life in their hearts. Goodbye. I press you and my dear children for the last time to my breast. Alexandre B. I cannot express my grief at the loss of my beloved father. The memory of it will never leave me, and only time has diminished the intensity of the emotion this horrible death aroused. In addition to this calamity, we were harassed by other alarms. The Princess of Hohenzollern was as distracted with grief as we were ourselves. Her brother, the Prince de Salm, had perished the same day as my father. We spent our days with her, sharing each other's sorrow. The princess had only one desire, to leave France. She prayed never to see again the country where she had been brought up, which had become so dear to her, but where she had suffered so cruel a loss.